The Art of Euthanasia by Fuboku Kosakai.
Before I begin the story proper, I should say a few words about what I mean by the art of euthanasia. The term is not difficult, it means simply the art of allowing a person to die peacefully, and is, so to speak, a translation of the English word euthanasia. To let someone die peacefully means that when an illness is beyond all hope, the patient is spared needless suffering at the end and is helped, by injection, medicine, or some other means, to die with as little pain and as much ease as possible. Euthanasia is said to have been widely practiced in Roman times, and Thomas More's Utopia is said to describe people being put to death by that means. I do not know whether anyone in Japan has reflected upon euthanasia since ancient times, but I imagine that more than a few physicians, driven by necessity, must have practiced it. After graduating from T Medical College, I spent 2 years in the Department of Internal Medicine under Professor B. I then opened a practice in H Village, deep in the mountains of my native Mino. I had never cared much for city air, so I rejected my friend's insistence that I establish myself in Tokyo and began an easygoing life in the countryside. A university-trained doctor was a rarity in such a remote district, and my practice prospered considerably. Some patients traveled as much as 10 ri to consult me, while I rode 2 or 3 ri each day to make house calls. Even during my years in the Department of Internal Medicine, I witnessed the deaths of many patients and thought deeply about euthanasia. When a patient was doomed beyond recovery, could it truly be called proper treatment to administer camphor and other cardiac stimulants, forcibly rousing a failing heart and merely prolonging the patient's agony? For a cancer patient at the point of death, would it not be a far greater mercy to give a large dose of morphine, abolish the pain completely, and let the patient die as though falling asleep? Such thoughts were always with me. The suffering of patients with acute peritonitis, for example, was too terrible to watch. Seeing them writhe upon their beds, struggling and screaming, one had to harden one's heart before administering a stimulant. And when a patient with meningitis had lost consciousness yet seemed to feel only violent pain, with not even the slightest hope of recovery, was it not more humane to let that patient die peacefully as soon as possible? I believe one powerful reason human beings fear death is their fear of the suffering that attends it, the so-called agony of death. If there were no unspeakable torment at life's end, people would not fear death nearly so much. Elderly people commonly say that when their time comes, they hope to die suddenly of a stroke or something similar, without suffering. As death draws nearer, it is natural to think about it, and the first desire that arises is invariably the wish for an easy death. The Emperor Augustus is said to have cried, "Euthanasia, euthanasia." If any of us were stricken with an incurable disease and faced terrible suffering at the end, we would probably choose death in order to escape it. My own experience has furnished many such cases. Often a family, unable to bear the sight of a patient suffering, would plead, "If there is no hope of saving this life, could you not spare them such torment and let them die peacefully soon?" At times the patients themselves clasped their hands and begged me to let them die quickly. Yet under the law, a physician today may under no circumstances take measures to cause a patient's death. Anyone who deliberately practices euthanasia must face an appropriate punishment. Thus every doctor, even knowing that treatment will do nothing but increase suffering, nevertheless gives camphor injections and tries to prolong life by 10 or 20 minutes. At the deathbed, give camphor becomes an almost unconscious routine, while the patient's pain is disregarded. This is a common failing among physicians today. But perhaps it is not the doctors who are at fault so much as the law. Some may object that camphor occasionally brings about a miraculous recovery, and that even in an apparently hopeless case it is a doctor's duty to attempt the injection. That depends upon the disease. In acute pneumonia, camphor may sometimes work a miracle. In a malignant tumor, no such miracle occurs. And it is precisely malignant tumors that cause the most intense suffering. Anyone who truly understands that pain cannot remain indifferent to it. In Europe and America, opposition to vivisection is vigorous because people cannot bear to see laboratory animals suffer needlessly. In Britain in particular, I understand that operations on animals must, whenever circumstances permit, be performed under anesthesia. If even an animal's pain commands such concern, it goes without saying that a physician must pay the most profound attention to human suffering. One purpose of medicine is, after all, to relieve the anguish caused by illness. I therefore came to believe that physicians ought to study and practice euthanasia. Nevertheless, while I remained in the Department of Internal Medicine, I never once attempted it. If I deliberately broke the law and were discovered, the consequences would fall not only upon me but upon Professor B and the entire department, which I could not allow. Against my conscience, therefore, I did what the others did and, hardening my heart, inflicted meaningless suffering on many patients. As this happened again and again, I longed to leave the city as soon as possible and gain the freedom to act according to my conscience. My mother was also waiting alone and lonely for my return to our native village, so the 2 years I had allotted myself seemed very long indeed. As soon as I returned to the mountain village and opened my practice, I began secretly practicing euthanasia upon many patients. In nearly every case I used a large dose of morphine. A patient who had been gasping in terrible agony only moments before would soon fall into a peaceful sleep after the injection and pass away without awakening. Naturally, I told the family that recovery was impossible but that I would use every means to reduce the patient's pain while preserving life even a moment longer. Then I administered the morphine. When they saw the patient die asleep with such a peaceful expression, the family would say in unison that an easy death was at least some consolation. Strangely, as this happened repeatedly, word spread that, with that doctor, one can die very peacefully, and my doorway became busier than ever. A Western proverb says, "A bad doctor kills, while a good doctor lets die." I felt keenly that merely allowing people to die peacefully was enough to earn a reputation as a great physician. It was bitterly ironic. A great physician ought to save the sick, yet I had become one by letting them die. In that, I realized, lay something unfathomable in the psychology of society. Once I had acquired such a reputation, I became all the more determined never to let a patient suffer, and so I practiced euthanasia still more frequently. I kept it an absolute secret even from my own family, and for some 9 years I lived without difficulty. Then one day an incident not only shattered my principle that euthanasia ought to be practiced, but caused me to abandon medicine altogether. What? You think my euthanasia was discovered? No, that was not it. Please listen patiently to the end. Before describing that incident, I must tell you something about my family. When I opened my practice in my native village, I married a woman from a distantly related household in the same village. The following year she bore me a son, Yoshio. Sadly, about a year after his birth, my wife contracted severe typhoid fever and died. What? Did I practice euthanasia then as well? No. Her illness was so severe that her consciousness was clouded, and she died without suffering. After her death, my mother raised Yoshio in her place, and I lived without remarrying. In the spring when Yoshio was 7, my aged mother died of a stroke. Soon afterward, finding the household difficult to manage, I followed the advice of others and took a second wife from O City, near my village. It may seem odd to praise my own child, but Yoshio was extremely intelligent, and I feared that being left in a stepmother's hands might cast a dark shadow over his heart. Fortunately, my second wife loved him sincerely, and he adored her as his true mother. For about a year, we lived in great happiness and peace. Besides the 3 of us, the household included a nurse, a maid, and a hired man who tended the horse. All were good-natured, and a bright sun seemed to shine over our home. Then, without warning, a cruel storm broke over that bright household. My wife, Yoshio's stepmother, underwent a complete change of character. First she became fiercely jealous. If I spoke a little too long with the nurse or the maid, she openly vented her anger upon them and upon me. Next she began treating Yoshio with great cruelty, thundering at him over the smallest mistake. I assumed it was a temporary change of temperament caused by pregnancy, and endured it as patiently as I could, believing she would regain her calm in time. But her hysterical conduct worsened by the day, until she even told Yoshio, "A wicked, insolent child like you ought to die." Yoshio, however, was exceptionally obedient and tried so pitifully hard to keep his mother pleased that it hurt to watch him. When the maid or hired man took pity on him and tried to protect him, it only provoked my wife's anger further. Eventually she began beating him for no substantial reason. Troubled, I considered what to do, but decided that we probably had only to endure until the birth. I quietly instructed Yoshio that no matter how unreasonable his mother became, he must always apologize and say, "Please forgive me." He faithfully obeyed, bearing a considerable burden of anxiety for so young a child. Fortunately, he had begun attending elementary school by then, which gave him time away from her and was, if anything, a relief. The school stood about 5 cho from our house, and the road passed a steep cliff some 10 cho high. For the first month after he enrolled, I had our maid Osei escort him there and back. Afterward, Yoshio made the journey alone. When I returned from my calls in the evening, he would hear the horse's hooves and run happily to meet me at the gate. Whenever I saw his innocent face, I could not help comparing it with my wife's heartlessness and feeling deeply sad. Then came a day in the rainy season, dark and overcast. It induced the same oppressive mood that Takuboku described in his verse. As I gazed upon the leaden sky, I found myself wanting to kill someone. The heavy black clouds hanging over the mountains seemed like poisonous breath exhaled by a demon, and an uncanny feeling filled the air. That day I had again traveled a considerable distance on my rounds. I returned at about 5 in the afternoon, utterly exhausted, and noticed that Yoshio, who always came to the gate, was nowhere to be seen. Wondering what had happened, I led the horse to the stable myself, for the hired man had gone home the day before to visit his sick mother. When I entered the house, my wife rushed out and said angrily,
"Honestly, isn't Yoshio shamelessly disobedient? He went out to play and still hasn't come home. I wonder what happened. Perhaps something kept him at school."
I knew there could be no business at the school, but I spoke gently as I stood in the entryway, trying not to anger my wife.
"Of course not. He doesn't want to see my face, so he means to come home late on purpose."
He was a child who almost never went out to play, and an inexpressible anxiety rose within me. Still afraid of upsetting my wife, I said, "Could you have Osei look for him nearby?"
"Osei is out on an errand with Kato," she replied curtly. Kato was the nurse's name.
At that moment many voices sounded near the gate. A dreadful premonition made me freeze, and my wife and I instinctively looked at one another. Her eyes burned like fire.
"Doctor, your boy."
The moment I ran outside, a villager saw me and cried out. Yoshio, his school uniform covered in mud, was being carried on a wooden door by 4 or 5 men from the village.
"Poor child. We found him below the cliff. He still seems to be breathing, so please, treat him quickly."
I cannot now clearly remember what I did next. In any event, a few minutes later Yoshio lay on his back upon the bed in one corner of my consulting room, while my wife and I stood at his pillow examining his wounds. After the villagers had gone, the room was deathly still, and the ticking of the clock seemed to gouge my heart. Yoshio appeared to have struck the rocks below the cliff face first. 3 or 4 ribs in the front right side of his chest were broken, leaving a blood-soaked depression as large as 2 fists placed together. His eyes remained tightly closed, and his breathing was extremely shallow. His pulse was almost impossible to feel, but through the stethoscope I could clearly hear his heart continuing to beat.
I rose like a machine and took the bottle of cardiac stimulant, camphor, and the syringe from the glass table in the center of the room. "What are you doing?" my wife demanded in a trembling voice, blocking me. "Do you mean to make Yoshio suffer?"
Perhaps I hesitated for an instant. Perhaps my reason whispered in my ear that although I always advocated euthanasia, I showed no compassion for my own child's suffering. Be that as it may, the principle I had upheld for 10 years shattered into fragments in that moment. Human beings act not only through reason but also by reflex. Now that reflex left me no leisure even to consider logic. I pushed my wife aside and injected 3 ampoules into Yoshio's arm. She seemed to be saying something again and again, but not a word reached my ears. Before my eyes, the color of Yoshio's lips changed from purple to red. "It's working," I cried inwardly. When I injected a 4th ampoule, he opened his eyes wide.
"Yoshio, do you understand me?" I asked, bending over him.
He nodded faintly. Tears streamed from my eyes. Then Yoshio began moving his lips. He was evidently trying to say something. Suddenly my wife thrust out her right hand and pressed it hard over Yoshio's mouth and nose, as though intending to suffocate him. "What are you doing?" I seized her shoulder with all my strength and dragged her backward. She fell heavily onto the floor and overturned the glass table. The violent crash of breaking glass seemed to startle Yoshio as well. He gave a soft moan and tried to speak. Forgetting everything else in the world, I concentrated my whole being upon his lips.
Mother, please forgive me. When Mother pushed me off. I wish I had died at once.
The shock was like an axe striking the crown of my head. Everything suddenly went dark, and I felt myself losing consciousness. Yet I dimly saw the bloody foam of Yoshio's final breath upon his lips, and dimly heard my wife's deranged voice behind me.
Oh ho ho ho. I told you not to use a cardiac stimulant. Oh ho ho ho.
The Japanese Mystery Library. Classic mysteries from Japan in English. Subscribe to hear the next story.